So, the early hours of the 20th of January 2021 GMT, and it's time for a video on the legacy of Donald Trump. Now, it's very difficult to approach a subject like this in a condensed form um, because it's been such a turbulent 4 years that I'd be concerned about leaving something out that is important. So, I'm going to really just look at this from very basic levels. And no doubt there'll be other things to say, but this will suffice, I think, for now. Um, where does one start with Donald Trump? Where does one start? Um, there are academic studies of ratings of American presidents, and if you look at the source on Wikipedia, there's various links, various studies have been done, reputable pollsters, universities, and so on. And Trump basically is in the very, very bottom quartile. The only presidents that tend to rank worse is James Buchanan, um, who, of course, presided over the situation just before the American Civil War. Maybe Franklin Pierce. And William Henry Harrison isn't usually judged because he was in office for such a short time. Warren Harding fares pretty badly. But certainly, you'd be hard pushed to find many presidents with such a low rating. Now, the caveat to that is that history is the real judge. And I always say it's difficult to judge a leader immediately after their term of office. So, as of today, Trump will be out of office. But I think even the passage of time, even 10 years, 20 years, I would be very, very surprised if there is another president in that office that is as controversial in terms of character, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of his influence on domestic sociology, for want of a better term, than Donald Trump. I really do think it would be hard pushed. I remember, I'm old enough to remember the Bush years, Bush 43, that is. And, Bush was very controversial, especially because of Iraq, but also controversial elements of his presidency. But when I see George W. Bush now, he seems like a normal ex president. That's not to gloss over the darker sides of his legacy, but when George W. Bush seems like a intelligent elder statesman by comparison, I think that really gives some idea of just how polarizing Trump is. Let's not forget this man was not a politician. He was a showman. He was an eccentric billionaire, a brash businessman. Before he got into politics, I never got a good vibe from Trump. I saw him as sort of taking delight in firing people. The Apprentice. Not that I watched it, but that was my perception. Um, I remember a Time magazine article years ago, it would have been about 2012, something like that, kind of mentioned Trump in small print thinking about the presidency. And, that was bad news. And then, of course, he ran and he won, albeit he didn't win the popular vote. Um, I think Trump's very ignorant, but that's not necessarily the same as stupid. I think he's incredibly ignorant about history and world affairs, but he's not stupid insofar as he has managed to become the most powerful man in the world, or depending what way you look at that, Putin and Xi could also vie for that claim. But certainly an office that's long been regarded as the most powerful in the world. Um, so he was clever enough to get there, clever enough to manipulate millions of people. And here's the thing, if I could just cut to the chase, I think that the events of the last few weeks definitely have overshadowed a lot of his legacy. Because even strong Trump supporters and apologists like Mitch McConnell have changed their tune. And I do think that a lot of the attitudes from politicians comes from the fact that, they were directly targeted with this. Um, we had a similar situation in the UK 4 years ago, 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, when with the Westminster terror attack, and House of Commons was put into a lockdown. And that was a terrorist attack. I've just watched footage from what actually happened inside the Capitol building. I've seen fleeting news reports, but this was an extensive footage from a reporter that was inside, and it was it's shocking. There was violence, and that was, mob rule is always a scary thing. I think it was George Carlin that said, never underestimate the power of idiots together. Um, just as an example of this, some of these people were sort of browsing through documents and saying, "Oh, Cruz is against us. He's turned on us. Oh, wait, he's voting against the Arizona uh, the Arizona recount or for the Arizona recount." But they contradicted themselves. If you look at the video, I'll try and put a link. It's staggering, staggering. And these people, they say to the police that, "Oh, we're not against you guys," and yet in the very same event, you can hear protesters saying, "Traitors, hang them all." It's sheer mob mentality, and I do think that they should be arrested. Now, I've said a lot about the culture wars, and I'm going to say more about that in another video. But for the sake of time management, I'm going to just stick with Trump on this one. I'm not going to speak so much about the woke left and all that sort of thing. I've been very critical of them as well. But I would say this: if, like me, you're very, very critical of the regressive left and wokeism and identity politics and critical race theory and all those sort of things, um, I would urge you to use reason and don't look at Donald Trump. It's probably too late saying this now, but I think a lot of people look to Donald Trump as kind of the bulwark to all of that. I mean, the Democrats need to understand why this man got into power. And it's all very well to dismiss, the QAnon nuts and Second Amendment extremists and so on, but millions of people support this man and still do. That's not coming from nothing. Trump was clever enough to manipulate that to play in those sentiments. Now, Grim Milestone's just passed 400,000 dead from COVID in the United States. That's very soon going to surpass the total. Well, it's already surpassed actually the American military toll of World War II. If it keeps going at this rate, it could even reach the levels of fatalities from the American Civil War, which are generally thought to be between 600 and 750,000. That's kind of the median figure. Some figures are higher. But that's the way it's going. Now, the caveat, of course, to that is it would be absurd to blame Trump for all those deaths. But he has absolutely had a cavalier attitude to it, other than um, pointing to the fact it began in China. Um, but domestically, the statements that he's come out with, the fact he hasn't even attended coronavirus meetings, his attitude very much like other populists, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil comes to mind. Um, that's an utter failure of leadership, the deadliest event in the United States of America. Basically, it is the deadliest event. If you look at all the wars, I'm talking about within a frame of time, within a year. Of course, millions died in the European colonization of the Americas from disease and so on. But that was over a long period. This is within 1 year. Um, like I said, there's so many things to say about Trump. I do want to touch on one thing before I forget this. The rhetoric, Trump apologists say that's just words. He doesn't really mean it. What really matters is his policies. I strongly disagree with that. I think when you're that powerful, when you're that influential, words absolutely matter. Absolutely. This man's a compulsive liar. He says things, then denies it with a straight face. I think he probably is mentally unstable. Um, his war with the media is, there's a lot of commentary to be had with that. Absolutely, there's bias in the likes of CNN. I don't think they've particularly helped. But free press is an absolute hallmark of democracy. And Trump has acted like a tin pot tyrant. who cannot take criticism. You know, to those Trump supporters, did they really think that Obama was given an easy ride by Fox News for 8 years? He wasn't. Every president gets criticized. Only one president throws a tantrum the way Trump does. And okay, Nixon occasionally had very testy moments. Most presidents do. But, I think even Richard Nixon came across as, at least on the surface, had a facade of statesmanship. Nixon was an experienced politician, corrupt as hell, but he at least put on a facade of a statesman. Donald Trump is not a statesman. He just isn't. He's a powerful figure, or was, by nature of his office, but he's not a statesman. His supporters will point to the North Korea, the Singapore summit. Well, that fell flat. Imagine had Obama done that. Imagine the response from the right if, that had been Obama shaking Kim's hand. I've been disappointed recently to see some Hong Kong activists become, cheerleaders for Trump. But I would say to them, if you really think Trump's all about human rights, what about human rights in North Korea? What about his statement supporting the Uyghur concentration camps? Sure, he calls it genocide now. But again, this is just a hallmark of the man being so inconsistent in his public statements. That isn't clever, that's unstatesmanlike and it's reckless. Um, People say I'm being unfair. Well, let's look at the more positive sides. Within the Middle East of late, there has been significant diplomacy. Trump and his administration, that's a point of credit. Israel and its neighbors, have definitely improved relations. That is a point of credit. Trump administration took out Baghdadi, who was one of the world's most ruthless and callous terrorists. In my opinion, that was morally justified. But I do believe that Trump is no guarantor of human rights. This is a man who's advocated torture. Again, I put that to his Hong Kong supporters. Trump supports torture. I mean, he's on record for supporting waterboarding. Whatever happens in the next 4 years, I think the culture wars are going to continue. No question about that. But with Biden, at least there's a sense of normality returning. He might be a mediocre president. He might be a weak president. He might be a strong president. We don't know yet. But he's normal. And at least compared to Trump. And I think that's going to be very, very refreshing. I really do. Um, I think a lot of America's allies will actually be breathing a sigh of relief today. But, Trump may leave office, but I think he's going to be an agitator from the outside. He's saying our journey only begins, whatever that means. But back to the point about his statements, the sort of things that he has come out with, you could say, oh, that's just a businessman talking, and he's very polite behind closed doors. I've heard the likes of Piers Morgan say that he's actually very different behind the cameras. Well, what does that say if that's the case? It says that he's a phony. It says that he's a showman, at best. I don't think that's a hallmark of something to praise. But, I'm talking here as someone I'm not a never Trumper. I can't stand wokeism. I can't stand identity politics. I just think it's a very sad situation that intelligent adults who oppose all that stuff think that Trump is the reasonable alternative. This is a man, in my opinion, who has utterly disgraced his office. And that's how he will go down. So the more positive aspect, probably the best thing about the Trump presidency will be this recent diplomacy with Israel and its neighbors. I think that might go down as one of the best things. But that's been overshadowed because This is a president who cares more about Twitter feuds before he was banned than actually being a statesman and doing his job as president. All the last few months, all this pushing conspiracy theories, pushing the narrative that the vote was stolen. Put it this way, in 2000, when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of George W. Bush, Al Gore was disappointed. The Democrats were angry and disappointed. But it wasn't the same situation. Gore accepted the result because he was a statesman. He understood it had to be that way for the greater good. Gore could have become a renegade figure. He could have. We could have seen similar scenes of Democrats behaving like what happened on the 6th, but that didn't happen. So I honestly think, historians can microanalyze the Trump presidency, but I honestly think this man is going to go down as a demagogue. I really do. Um, China, this is a very critical thing because the Trump Biden years may be seen as the point when China surpassed the United States. Now, again, this is an area I'm prepared to be a bit more generous to Trump. He has changed the rhetoric on China. And I believe the Chinese Communist Party is one of the biggest threats to freedom in this world, if not the single biggest threat. I really do. And I think that too many Democrats and too many left wing people are still profoundly naive about that. Trump can be crude in that, but he's not actually wrong in this regard in terms of toughening the rhetoric on China. It is true that Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama were too passive, especially Obama, it has to be said. The pivot to Asia, I think, will be seen as a historical mistake because it's dealing with a communist party that cannot be trusted. And their whole approach to the coronavirus pandemic is testament to that. I don't blame Trump for coronavirus. I blame the Chinese Communist Party, as the whole world should. I think individual leaders, including Trump, should be assessed on their domestic response, and Trump's has been appalling. But the fundamental point about China being the source isn't wrong. Um, if Biden's weak on China, it will be unforgivable. But again, I don't really think that Trump's motivated by human rights. I really don't. I think he's motivated more by ego and by the trade situation. But at least a toughened rhetoric is not a bad thing when it comes to China. I think there should be hate on China. He boasted that he hasn't started any wars. Well, technically that's true, but this notion Trump the pacifist is nonsense because he's engaged in military campaigns as part of ongoing wars, bombing campaigns against Assad and ISIS, which I think would be seen as historically justifiable. But that's he's not a pacifist. Uh, Trump conducted the largest. His administration conducted the largest non-nuclear bomb I understand in history, Moab in Afghanistan in 2017 against the Taliban um, base. But here's the biggest problem with Donald Trump. It's not even a left-right issue. It's not a good policy versus bad policy. It's the temperament of this man. Utterly unstatesmanlike rhetoric. It's unstable nature. I think that has to be taken very seriously in any assessment of Donald Trump because I mean, look at his administration. Look at the number of officials that have left it. I can't think of any other one-term president where that's been the case. Look at the number of former Trump allies that have turned on him. You really would be hard pushed to find a president that's so polarized, except by his hardcore supporters. And in the end of the day, you come down to the question, well, Trump was right all along and everyone else was wrong. You consider maybe everyone else was actually right in their assessment. I haven't even mentioned his relations with Russia, his statements about Putin. And I think, again, the unstable nature of this president, there's a disconnect between the State Department and Trump the man. So the State Department has responded robustly with Russia, but Trump himself, standing beside Vladimir Putin, said, "You see what I have to put up with," pointing to the press that were there. It's totally shameless. So I've got some concerns about Biden. I've concerns about his age. I've got concerns about the far left within the Democrats. But I still think that even if Biden's a weak president, he's at least presidential. This matters. It really, really matters because you can be damn sure that China and Russia will be looking at this situation, looking at Trump's rhetoric, looking at the conspiracy theories he pushes. I mean, there's a reason Russia today loves Trump. Absolutely. So I'll round this up. I didn't even mention gun control. The worst mass shooting in American history, Las Vegas. Trump's response was to make some amendments to do with bumpers. You know, one of the gravest issues facing America before coronavirus, that was his response. Um, I mean, I've no doubt that he's absolutely the worst president of my lifetime and one of the worst ever because the good points, you know, changing the narrative on China, diplomacy regarding Israel and its neighbors, and taking out the world's most ruthless terrorist, all good policies. Also acting against the Assad regime, I have to say. Um, but all those things are overshadowed by everything else because when you degrade the very foundation of the office that you're in, it overshadows everything else anyway. And that's what I believe has happened with the Trump presidency. He certainly won't be forgotten. Um, I'll leave it there, but that is my assessment. Um, love it or leave it. That's my assessment.